Aaron never expected that missing his bus would change his life. One cold afternoon, he crossed the street to help a lost stranger with a paper map. Not knowing that small choice would ripple further than he could imagine, what began as a simple walk through winding city streets turned into an unexpected connection. A letter and a gift so extraordinary it could rewrite his future. But with the gift came a challenge to turn quiet dreams into something real. This is the story of how a boy with nothing but a sketchbook found himself standing at the edge of a life he never thought possible. All because he stopped to help. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. Aaron sat on the cold metal bench, elbows resting on his knees, the straps of his frayed backpack looped loosely around his hands. The late afternoon light had turned thin and slanted, stretching shadows of lampposts across the cracked pavement. The bus was supposed to have arrived 15 minutes ago, but the stop's flickering display still flashed delayed in a tired orange glow. He didn't check the time again. He knew it wouldn't make the bus come any faster. His sneakers, once white, were worn to a shade between gray and dust, the soles peeling slightly at the edges. He'd glued them twice already, each time with the kind of care usually reserved for fragile things. Pressing the seams together and waiting as long as his patience would allow before walking on them again. He tapped one foot lightly against the ground now, not from impatience, but to keep the cold from creeping too far into his toes. Around him, the bus stop held its usual mix of strangers bound together by nothing but inconvenience. A woman in a navy coat scrolled on her phone, her face lit blue in the fading sun. A man in a faded baseball cap leaned against the post, muttering to himself. Aaron noticed all of them without looking directly, his gaze trained just off-center, so no one thought he was staring. It was a habit, this way of watching people, quietly, without making himself a part of their moment. He shifted his backpack slightly, feeling the rough seam where the fabric had worn thin. Inside were a few textbooks, a pack of loose-leaf paper, and a sketchbook wrapped in a plastic grocery bag to keep it from getting bent. He didn't open it here. The bus stop was too exposed, and he liked to draw in places where no one's eyes could follow the pencil. Taxi slowed in front of the corner convenience store across the street. Aaron didn't notice it at first, not until the passenger door opened and a man stepped out. The cab lingered for a moment before pulling away, leaving the man standing there in the brittle light, turning in a small circle, as if the street might rearrange itself into something familiar. He was holding a folded map, not the glowing screen kind, but a real paper one, creased so many times it looked soft at the edges. His hands shook as he tried to orient it, though whether from the cold or nerves, Aaron couldn't tell. The man wore a charcoal overcoat that looked expensive, but his posture wasn't the kind that came with money. He kept glancing from the map to the street signs, then back again, his brow furrowed in concentration. His mouth moved as if he was sounding out words to himself. Aaron could hear fragments of something not English, not fully slipping between the traffic noise. A few people passed him without slowing down. One man in a hoodie shook his head when the stranger tried to speak to him. The woman in the navy coat at the bus stop glanced over once, then back to her phone. Aaron watched for another moment, weighing it. He had nowhere urgent to be, though he'd been hoping to get home before the apartment's hallway lights flickered. Out for the night. But there was something about the way the man's eyes darted between the buildings, like a person trying to match a dream to reality, that made Aaron stand. He crossed the street during a lull in the traffic, his sneakers hitting the asphalt with a muted slap. Up close, the man's expression was more lost than anxious, his voice soft but strained when he spoke. The words came in a tumble, some English, some not, the syllables bumping into each other. Aaron caught only a few in bridged old street. He glanced at the map, the hand-drawn star in the corner, the notes scrawled in a looping handwriting. He knew where it was. Across town, past the old market square. He nodded once, pointing in the general direction, but the man's face didn't ease. So Aaron shifted the strap on his backpack, jerking his chin toward the side street. "Come on," he said quietly. "I'll walk you." The man's relief was immediate, visible in the way his shoulders lowered just a fraction. He stepped. In beside Aaron, the paper map still clutched tightly in his hand. Behind them, the bus stop display kept flashing, delayed, and the people waiting kept scrolling, muttering, or staring at the pavement. Aaron didn't look back. Aaron slowed his steps as he got closer, not wanting to startle the man. He'd learned that approaching strangers too quickly could make them defensive, especially in this part of the city where people were used to quick exchanges or none at all. The man was older than Aaron had first thought from across the street, maybe in his late 50s, with lines etched deep at the corners of his eyes. His coat was neatly buttoned, but there was a kind of weariness in the way he held himself, as though the weight of the folded map in his hand was heavier than it should have been. "Excuse me," the man said, or something close to it. The consonants softened, stretched. His accent pulled the words sideways, giving them an unfamiliar shape. Aaron heard fragments he recognized and others he didn't, syllables that could have been French or Italian, words that might have been German but blurred at the edges. He wasn't sure if the man was blending them intentionally or if stress was tangling the languages together. The man unfolded the map partway and jabbed at a spot with his finger. Near Old Bridge," he said, hesitating, then adding something that sounded like Mercado. Darren's mind pieced it together. "And near the market somewhere, close to the old stone bridge." We could picture it in his head, the narrow cobblestone streets, the row of antique lampposts, the faded sign that always creaked in the wind. Aaron nodded, but the man didn't relax. He was looking at the street signs like they were written in code, glancing back at the map as though it might change if he studied it long enough. People passed on either side, some stepping wide too. Avoid him, others brushing past without acknowledgement. The man tried again, speaking a string of words that looped between languages, his voice rising slightly as though he might make himself understood if he pushed the sounds harder. Aaron could have pointed, could have told him to follow Main until the street split, then keep right until he saw the bridge. But there was something in the man's eyes. Not panic exactly, a kind of isolation. Like he was adrift in a place where even the simplest things felt foreign. Aaron knew that feeling. He'd felt it himself in quieter ways at new schools and rooms where everyone already knew each other, in stores where the prices alone told him he didn't belong. "I know where it is," Aaron said. He gestured. "Down the side street? It's a bit of a walk, though?" "I can take you." The man blinked as if uncertain he'd understood. "You walk," Aaron nodded again. "Yeah, I'll walk you." The man's face softened, the tension in his brow easing just enough for a small, grateful smile to appear. "Thank you," he said carefully, almost testing the words. He folded the map with deliberate precision and tucked it into his coat pocket, still keeping one hand on it, as if to anchor himself. Aaron adjusted the strap of his backpack, feeling the familiar weight settle against his shoulder. He thought briefly of the bus, of the clock he wasn't checking, of the shift he was probably going to be late for again. The street ahead stretched, long, and the cold was starting to seep through the fabric of his hoodie. Still, he started walking, matching his pace to the man's slower steps. They moved past storefronts with fogged windows, the neon signs blinking half-heartedly in the fading light. The man glanced at them in passing, murmuring something under his breath in his own language. It's a sound that might have been recognition. Or longing. Aaron didn't ask. He just kept to the inside of the sidewalk, guiding them around the cracks and uneven patches without making it obvious. When they crossed the first intersection, the man tried again to explain where he needed to go, gesturing in a way that suggested landmarks rather than addresses. Aaron listened, catching only fragments but filling in the rest from the mental map he'd built of the city over years of walking it. So the man was headed exactly where Aaron thought he was, to the old part of town. The one tourists loved for its charm, and locals avoided for its overpriced cafes. They turned down a quieter street, the noise of traffic fading behind them. The man's breathing evened out. He didn't speak much now, just looked around with the quiet alertness of someone memorizing every detail in case he had to find it again. Aaron didn't mind the silence. He'd never been afraid of it. In a way, it made the walk easier, the two of them moving through the city together, without having to fill the air with words. Neither of them had enough of to make perfect sense. By the time they reached the bend that would lead them toward the market square, the light had deepened into that in-between color of dusk, and the first street lamps were starting to hum faintly overhead. Aaron glanced sideways at the man, saw the relief in his shoulders, and knew the choice to walk him had been the right one, even if it meant the bus, the job, and whatever came after could wait. The street began to narrow as they moved away from the main road, buildings leaning closer together, their upper floors almost touching above the cobblestone. The air smelled faintly of bread from a bakery a block over, though the shop's window had already gone dark for the day. Aaron kept his pace steady, adjusting slightly when he noticed the man's steps slowing on the uneven stones. The city here wasn't designed for speed. It was the kind of place you had to walk through with your eyes open, watching for dips in the ground and the way certain bricks stuck up just enough to catch your shoe. The man's gaze wandered in every direction, as if he couldn't decide where to look first. He would pause briefly to read the signs above closed shops, lips moving silently as he tested the words. Some were in English, most in the local language, and a few in the older script that only clung to this neighborhood now. Painted on weathered wood or etched into stone lintels, he pointed at one sign, an old tea shop with gold lettering, and asked Aaron something in halting English. Aaron pieced together the question. Had it been here a long time? Yeah, Aaron said. Since before my mom was born, probably. The man nodded like this was important to remember, though Aaron didn't know why. They walked on, their conversation happening in small bursts, a mix of English and the man's native language, with gestures filling the gaps where neither of them knew the right word. Aaron learned that the man's name was Joseph, though he didn't give a last name, and that he had arrived only yesterday. When Aaron asked if he was here for work or vacation, Joseph smiled faintly and said something important, then glanced away as if he'd already said too much. Aaron didn't press. People held their reasons close for all kinds of things. He thought of the way his own mother deflected questions from neighbors about her hours, her past jobs, or why they'd moved 3 times in the last 4 years. Some things were easier to leave unexplained. They passed under a row of old iron street lamps, their bulbs dim but steady. The glow lit up the uneven surfaces of the walls around them, making every chip in the plaster and every patch of exposed brick stand out. Aaron pointed out a shortcut through a narrow passage that cut between 2 buildings. Joseph hesitated at the entrance. It was barely wide enough for one person to pass, but Aaron stepped in first, the sound of his sneakers echoing softly in the enclosed space. At the far end, the alley opened onto a small square where a man was setting up tables outside a restaurant, even though the night air was already sharp. As they crossed the square, Joseph asked about the bridge. He had seen it on postcards, he said, but wanted to know if it was really as old as people claimed. Aaron told him it was, at least according to the plaques bolted to its railing. There were stories about soldiers marching across it, about festivals held there before the war, about the river freezing so solid one winter that people had walked across beside it instead of using the span. Joseph listened closely, his hands clasped behind his back now, his stride more certain. Every so often, he would murmur a word in his own language, perhaps noting it for later, perhaps talking to himself. When they reached the street that curved toward the market, the faint hum of evening activity met them. Shopkeepers pulling shutters closed. A few musicians setting up in the far corner, the air carrying the smell of roasting chestnuts. Pointed ahead. The inn's just past the square, he said. Joseph looked at him, that same faint smile returning, and said quietly, "Thank you for walking with me." Many would not. Aaron shrugged, the gesture automatic. It's not far, and I had time. That wasn't exactly true, but he figured there was no point in explaining. They fell into silence again as they skirted the edge of the square. The inn came into view slowly, its timber frame dark against the lighter plaster, the windows glowing warmly from within. Above the door, a painted sign swung gently in the breeze, the name written in an elegant curling script. Joseph's steps slowed, his eyes fixed on it, as though confirming something to himself. Aaron stopped beside him, but didn't ask what the important thing was. Whatever it was, it clearly belonged to the man alone. In that moment, standing in the soft light spilling from the doorway, Aaron felt like his role was simply to get Joseph here in one piece, and now that he had, the rest was up to him. They turned off the main street without warning, slipping into a narrow lane most tourists wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. The pavement changed under their feet, from uniform gray concrete to uneven stones patched with moss. The walls on either side were painted in layers of color from years of different owners, faded yellows, chipped blues, streaks of red where a door frame had been repainted but not the surrounding plaster. Joseph followed closely, glancing up and around as though the place itself might speak to him if he paid enough attention. "This way's faster," Aaron said, though his tone was casual, like it didn't matter. He knew the route well, a series of turns that zigzagged through old residential blocks, bypassing the long, crowded streets that funneled into the market square. It wasn't the most scenic path for someone seeing the city for the first time, but there was a kind of beauty here if you knew how to look for it. They passed a bakery with its shutters halfway down. Through the open gap, a warm smell of sugar and yeast drifted out. Joseph slowed, glancing inside. The woman behind the counter was stacking the last of the pastries into a display case. Her movements unhurried, as if the day had all but ended for her. Aaron paused long enough for him to take it in, then nodded toward the next turn. A few blocks later, they came to a brick wall covered in murals. Layers of them, some bright and fresh, others faded and cracked, the paint peeling where rain had seeped in. A tall figure in swirling blues stood beside a cluster of flowers the size of dinner plates. In one corner, a child's face had been painted in black and white, eyes looking toward the street. Aaron gestured toward it as they walked past. "Change that one every year. Different kids from the neighborhood." Joseph stepped closer to study it, tilting his head slightly. "Beautiful," he said softly, the word careful on his tongue. He lingered for another few seconds before pulling himself back to the path. Aaron kept checking his watch, though not in a way that was obvious. Hands moved past the time he should have been halfway to work by now. He imagined his boss's expression when he walked in late again, the tight jaw, the way she'd pause before deciding whether or not to say anything. But each time he thought about speeding up, he glanced at Joseph and decided against it. The man's shoulders had loosened since they'd left the bus stop. The way his eyes moved now had shifted from searching to noticing. They crossed a quiet courtyard where laundry hung between windows, 3 stories up. The wind catching the corners of the sheets, so they fluttered like slow-moving flags. Joseph looked up at them with the faintest smile. Aaron realized that for all his own familiarity with this shortcut, he rarely took the time to see it the way someone new might. Another turn brought them into an alley, just wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. On the left, a small shop sold nothing but hand-carved wooden toys. The display window filled with miniature animals and tiny boats. Aaron had passed it 100 times but never gone in. Joseph slowed again, pressing a hand lightly against the glass as he peered inside. The owner, a gray-haired man with thick glasses, looked up from behind the counter and gave them both a brief nod. "This city," Joseph began, then stopped, searching for the word. "Layers." Aaron glanced at him. "Yeah, you just have to know where to walk." As they turned down the last stretch of the shortcut, the street widened slightly. The sound of distant voices and the faint strains of music drifting in from the direction of the market square. Joseph walked with more certainty now, his steps lighter. Aaron could feel the tension of the earlier confusion replaced with something calmer. He knew the shortcut had done more than just save time. It had given Joseph a piece of the city most visitors never saw. Still, Aaron's eyes flicked once more to his watch. He was late, there'd be consequences. But as the old stone arch that marked the market's edge came into view, he figured they could wait. For now, he kept his pace steady, letting Joseph take in the last of the alleys before the city opened up ahead of them. The intersection came into view as they rounded the last narrow corner, spilling them suddenly into noise and motion. Cars idled in long lines on either side, their headlights already glowing against the dim sky. The pedestrian signal flashed red, and a cluster of people waited on the curb, a delivery cyclist balancing a huge insulated bag, a woman clutching 2 grocery sacks in one hand and a child's mittened hand in the other, a man in a suit staring at his phone like the rest of the world didn't exist. Aaron slowed to a stop beside Joseph, the cold settling heavier now that they weren't moving. The wind funneled between the taller buildings, sharp enough to bite through his hoodie. He shoved his hands into the front pocket, tucking his chin slightly against the chill. Joseph glanced at him then, really looked, his eyes dropping to the thin fabric of Aaron's sleeves. His own coat was buttoned high, a thick scarf looped at his neck. The contrast must have been obvious. "No. Jacket?" Joseph asked, his accent drawing the words out gently. Aaron shrugged without meeting his eyes. "Didn't think I'd need one." It was easier than saying the truth that his one decent coat had a broken zipper and hung useless in the back of the closet, and the only other option was a hand-me-down too small in the shoulders. The light stayed red, the traffic impatient but trapped by the cycle. Joseph shifted, reaching into his coat pocket. His hand emerged with a folded stack of bills worn at the edges. He extended it toward Aaron, his expression earnest, not pitying. "For help," he said, the words careful. "Cold? You take?" "Yes." Aaron's eyes flicked to the money, then back to Joseph's face. The offer was simple, maybe even practical, but something in him bristled.
"Ow."
He shook his head once, firm, but not unkind. "I'm fine." Joseph frowned slightly, as if trying to understand whether Aaron hadn't heard him or was refusing. It is nothing. Small. For you." Aaron took a breath, feeling the weight of the bills between them, the cold wind, the noise of the street pressing in. He stepped back half a pace, hands still in his hoodie pocket. "You needed to get there," he said quietly. "That's enough." For a moment, Joseph didn't move. The money stayed in his hand, suspended in the space between them. Slowly, he folded it again and slipped it back into his pocket, his gaze still fixed on Aaron, like he was studying something he hadn't expected to find. The signal turned green, and the crowd surged forward across the painted lines. Aaron and Joseph moved with them, their steps syncing automatically. The wind was worse in the middle of the intersection, cutting through gaps between the cars. Aaron kept his head down, eyes on the far curb, counting the steps out of habit. On the other side, the crowd dispersed quickly, peeling off into shops or side streets. The city noise shifted back into its layered hum. Joseph walked silently for a block, his pace a touch slower than before. When he finally spoke, it was quieter, almost to himself. "Not many. Say no." Aaron glanced at him. "You didn't need to pay me. You were lost. Now you're not."
"That's it."
Joseph nodded once, the corners of his mouth tightening, not in disapproval, but in a way that suggested he was storing the moment away. Aaron didn't ask what he was thinking. He didn't need to. There was a different kind of understanding. In the silence that followed, one that didn't require words, just the steady rhythm of their footsteps as the cold air pushed them onward, toward the edge of the market. The street opened into a quieter stretch, the noise of the market fading behind them until it was replaced by the softer sounds of evening. The faint clink of cutlery from a second-story window, the low hum of a radio spilling from somewhere. Unseen. The inn stood at the far end, its timber frame dark against pale plaster, the upper floors leaning slightly as if age had pressed down on them over the years. Warm light glowed from the windows, and a painted wooden sign swayed gently. In the breeze above the doorway, its lettering elegant but worn. Joseph slowed his pace as they approached, his eyes fixed on the building like it was the final piece of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve since he stepped out of that taxi.
Yes.
Aaron stopped with him, glancing toward the sign to make sure it was the right place. It was the carved emblem of the bridge was unmistakable. The moment they both just stood there. Joseph seemed to be taking in the details, the brass door handle dulled by decades of use, the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from a chimney somewhere behind the building, the way the curtains in the front windows shifted slightly with the draft. Then he turned to Aaron, and there was a different look in his eyes now. Something settled, like the tension of being lost had finally given way to the relief of arrival. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they landed, with a weight that made Aaron glance at him a little longer than he meant to. Joseph extended his hand, the gesture formal, deliberate. Aaron shook it, feeling the firm grip, the warmth of the man's palm still carrying the chill of the air around them. They let go. Joseph's other hand was already moving to the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and began flipping through the bills inside. "Please," he said, glancing down as he sorted the notes. "For your time." For Aaron took a step back before the offer could take shape. He lifted a hand in a small wave, not dismissive, but final. "Safe travels," he said, his voice steady. There was nothing else to add. Joseph hesitated, the wallet still open. In his hand, his brow furrowed slightly, and for a second it looked as though he might insist, but then he stopped. His shoulders eased just enough to suggest he understood that Aaron wasn't refusing out of pride, but because the walk had never been a transaction. Slowly, Joseph slid the wallet back into his pocket, his gaze still fixed on Aaron like he was trying to commit his face to memory. Aaron gave him one last nod, then turned and started back the way they had come. The stones of the street were slick with a faint sheen, catching the lamplight in uneven glimmers. He didn't look back, though he could feel the weight of Joseph's eyes on him until he rounded the corner. The cold settled deeper now that he was walking alone, the absence of conversation making the air feel sharper. His hands went into the front pocket of his hoodie again, his fingers finding the familiar worn seam inside. The streets he knew so well seemed quieter than usual, as if the city itself had shifted slightly during the short time he'd spent guiding a stranger through it. He passed the bakery again, now dark behind its shutters, and the mural wall, its colors muted in the dim light. The shortcut felt different on the way back, emptier, but not in a lonely way, more like a corridor that had served its purpose for the day. By the time he reached the main street, the buses had started running again. The stop he'd left an hour earlier, now crowded with people bundled in coats and scarves. Aaron didn't join them. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, turned his collar up against the wind, and kept walking toward the part of the city that was his, the echo of the handshake still faintly warm against his palm. By the time Aaron reached the corner grocery, the sky had fallen into full darkness, the street lamps casting shallow pools of yellow light onto the wet pavement. The bell above the door jingled sharply as he pushed it open, the warmth inside rushing over him in a wave that felt more like accusation than comfort. The familiar smell of old wood, ground coffee, and detergent wrapped around him. But before he could take more than 2 steps, a voice cut through from behind the counter. "You're late again." Mr. Felder stood at the register, his arms folded, his jaw tight. The man was in his late 50s, the permanent squint that made it hard to tell if he was annoyed or just trying to read the fine print on a price tag. Tonight, there was no mistaking it. This was annoyance. The store was quiet, just the hum of the refrigerators in the back and the faint rattle of rain against the glass. No customers to distract from the moment. Aaron dropped his backpack behind the counter, muttering, "Sorry." He pulled on the green apron that hung limply from its hook, its fabric stiff from too many washes. "Sorry doesn't mean much if it keeps happening," Felder said, stepping out from behind the register. "I've got a schedule to run here. Customers expect someone on the floor, not wandering in whenever they feel like it." Aaron kept his head down, tightening the apron strings around his waist. The truth was on the tip of his tongue. The taxi, the map, the walk across half the city to the old inn, but saying it out loud felt complicated. How did you explain choosing to guide a stranger over clocking in on time, knowing there was no way someone like Felder would see it as anything but irresponsibility? "It won't happen again," Aaron said instead. "That's what you said last time." Felder's voice had a practiced edge to it, the kind that didn't rise in volume but cut deeper for its steadiness. "If it does, I'm cutting your shifts. I've got kids from the college who'd take every hour you've got without thinking twice. You get what I'm saying?" Aaron nodded once, eyes on the floor. "Yeah, good," Felder said, though the word didn't sound like it carried much belief. He turned back toward the register. "Start in aisle 3. Stock came in late this afternoon, and it's still sitting on the dolly." Aaron slipped into the aisle, the narrow space lined with shelves of canned soup, pasta, and dusty jars. No one bought unless they were desperate. The cardboard boxes waited at the far end, stacked in uneven towers. He crouched down, pulled a box cutter from his pocket, and set to work. The rhythm of it was familiar. Slice the tape, fold back. The flaps lined the cans on the shelf in neat rows with the labels facing out. It was work that didn't require thinking, which was good, because his mind kept drifting back to Joseph standing in front of the inn. The weight of his handshake, the way he'd tried to press money into Aaron's hand. The store door opened and closed a few times while Aaron worked, customers coming in for a carton of milk or a loaf of bread. He kept to the aisles, avoiding the counter so Felder wouldn't start in again. The sound of rain against the windows grew softer, placed by the faint scratch of the store's old radio playing, something tinny and cheerful. By the time Aaron finished stocking the last shelf, his hand smelled faintly of cardboard and metal. From the can rims, he straightened, stretched his back, and glanced at the clock above the counter. He was only 2 hours into his shift, but it already felt longer. Felder hadn't spoken to him again, though Aaron caught him glancing over once or twice, the look unreadable. Aaron knew he'd have to work harder the rest of the week, keep his head down. Make up for tonight without asking for understanding he wasn't going to get. He wiped his hands on his apron, walked to the back room to break down the empty boxes, and told himself it was fine. He'd made the choice, and he'd make it again. But he didn't say it out loud. Some things were easier to keep quiet. Hallway smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and damp carpet. The kind of scent that clung no matter how many times the building manager claimed he'd taken care of it. Aaron climbed the last flight of stairs slowly, the weight of the day pulling at his legs. The bare bulb above their door flickered weakly, casting everything in uneven shadows. That was when he saw it. Another sheet of paper taped to the peeling blue paint, the edges curling from the draft that slipped in through the stairwell window. The red letters at the top were impossible to miss, past due. Same as the last one. Same as the one before that. The paper was crisp, as if whoever left it had just stepped away. He glanced down the hallway, but it was empty, except for Mrs. Vargas's. Kat sitting outside her door, watching him with unblinking eyes. Aaron peeled the notice from the door carefully, folding it once before slipping inside. The apartment was dim, the only light coming from the small lamp in the corner of the living room. Its shade was tilted, casting a slant of gold across the worn couch and the low table stacked with unopened mail. The heater rattled in the corner, clicking like it was deciding whether to keep working. His mother wasn't home. She wouldn't be for hours. Tuesdays meant a double shift, first at the laundry service, then straight to the late run at the diner. She usually came in around midnight, smelling of soap and grease, her hair pulled back tight, her voice quiet from too many hours of answering customers. Aaron moved to the kitchen, the thin carpet giving way to cracked linoleum. He set his backpack down and reached for the stack already on the counter, bound loosely with a rubber band. The pile of notices had been growing for months, their dates shifting from summer to fall to winter. He slid the new one into place without looking at the fine print. They all said the same thing. Money owed, time running out, eviction threatened. He stood there for a moment, leaning on the counter, his fingers pressing into the edges of the papers.
Atomize.
The refrigerator hummed weakly behind him. There were 3 magnets holding up a handful of things on its door. A photo of his mom when she was younger, standing on a beach somewhere he'd never been. A takeout menu with half the ink faded, and a list of bills she'd scrawled in pencil. Some with little check marks next to them, others left blank. Rent was always at the bottom, not because it wasn't important, but because everything else demanded to be paid first. He thought about what it would mean if the notices stopped, coming not because the rent was paid, but because it was too late for warnings. The idea made his chest feel tight. He picked up the stack again, weighed it in his hands, then set it back down exactly where it had been. Opening the fridge, he found the usual, a carton of milk, half empty and close to its date, a jar of pickles, 2 eggs in their carton, and a container of rice from the night before. He poured himself a glass of water instead, the tap sputtering before the stream came steady. The cold from it lingered on his fingers as he drank, his eyes drifting to the small table by the window. That's where his mother usually sat when she came home, sorting through bills, circling numbers in red pen like she could somehow change them just by making them stand out. Erin wondered if she'd seen the last notice yet, the one from last month. She hadn't said anything about it. Sometimes she didn't. Sometimes it was easier to pretend they weren't there until the next paycheck came in, and a little of the weight could be lifted. But the stack on the counter told the truth. He rinsed his glass, left it upside down in the dish rack, and glanced at the clock above the stove. It was still early, but the apartment felt heavier in the quiet. Thought about pulling out his sketchbook from his bag, losing himself in lines and shapes until the sound of her keys in the lock brought him back. Instead, he sat on the couch, the folded notice still in his pocket, and listened to the heater's uncertain hum. When she came home later, he'd hand her the paper without a word, and she'd add it to the stack like she always did. And then they'd go on because that was what they knew how to do. Keep moving, even when the red letters didn't stop coming. The kitchen was quiet, except for the soft hiss of boiling water from the small electric kettle Erin had set on the counter. The apartment's single window was fogged and outside. The city lights blurred through the damp glass like scattered fireflies. Erin peeled open the packet of instant noodles with slow fingers, careful not to tear the fragile wrapper too fast. The scent of dried spices and stale noodles filled the cramped space as he poured the hot water in, setting a small plate on the table to catch any spills. He sat down at the kitchen table, the peeling paint on its surface worn smooth from years of use. The packet said 3 minutes to cook, but he let it sit longer, staring out at the hazy skyline beyond the window. The noodles were his last meal until he could get more money or a shift at work. He'd already skipped lunch today. His eyes drifted to the corner of the table where a battered sketchbook lay, its edges curled and pages marked with faint smudges of graphite. He reached for it without hesitation, flipping the worn cover open to the middle where the bulk of his drawings lived, designs of shoes, each one more detailed than the last. Some were simple sturdy soles, thick laces, practical for walking long city streets. Others were fanciful high tops with glowing accents, sandals with woven straps that looked like branches curling around the ankle. Every page was filled with shapes and lines, notes in the margins about materials, stitching patterns, and the way light should reflect off different textures. Erin traced a finger over a drawing of a pair with soles designed to absorb shock, meant for people who walked all day on hard pavement. He had imagined it helping someone like his mother, someone who was on her feet from dawn until well past midnight. The shoes weren't just art to him. They were a way to fix things, to make the world a little easier for people who didn't ask for much. No one knew about the sketchbook. It's not his mother, not his boss at the grocery store, not his few friends at school. It was his secret, a place where hope and reality met, where he could dream without the weight of overdue notices or late shifts pressing down on him. He turned the page to a newer design, one with a flexible sole that could bend and twist, but still protect. Notes were scattered across the page, written in the shaky handwriting of someone tired but determined. Erin had taught himself to draw these by watching videos late at night on a cracked phone screen, scavenging scraps of leather and fabric from discarded shoes to practice stitching in his cramped bedroom. The noodles cooled beside him, forgotten. For a moment, as his mind filled with blueprints and possibilities, he imagined a workshop somewhere with tools and machines, piles of materials waiting to be shaped into something better. A place where he wasn't just passing time between shifts, but building something real. Something that carried his name quietly into the world. A soft creak from the floor made him glance up briefly, the old building settling, or maybe his mother moving around in the other room. He tucked the sketchbook closer, as if it were fragile or precious, and finally picked up the noodles again. The first bite was bland but warm, filling the hollow space in his stomach. As he ate, he let his fingers drift over the pages one last time before closing the book carefully, the soft thud of the cover like a promise. He'd keep working, keep drawing, keep dreaming in secret, because the world outside these walls was too loud, too sharp, too full of things he wasn't ready to explain. After finishing the noodles, he rinsed the bowl quietly in the sink, listening to the water run cold before drying it on a threadbare towel. The apartment was still dim, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the walls. Aaron sat back down at the table for a moment, hands folded, eyes distant. No one would ask him about his dreams tonight. No one would ask what he hoped for beyond making rent or keeping his job, and that was fine, because some things were meant to be held close, like the sketchbook on the table, a secret blueprint of a life he was still building, one quiet line at a time. A week had passed since the night Aaron guided Joseph through the twisting streets to the inn, and the routine of life had settled back into its usual rhythm, the hum of the grocery store, the weight of unpaid bills, the quiet moments alone with his sketchbook. But that evening, as he returned from work, a small change caught his eye. Tucked between the usual stack of bills and advertisements was an envelope unlike any he'd seen before. It was thick and heavy, the kind that suggested something important was inside. Aaron paused just outside the door to the apartment, studying the neat, looping handwriting sprawled across the front. It was addressed simply to Aaron, with no last name, no apartment number, and no return address. The ink was black, but smudged slightly at the edges, as if it had been written with care and then handled many times. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, and leaned against it as he examined the envelope. His fingers felt the weight of the paper, the slight texture beneath the surface, and the way the flap was sealed without a lick or tape, just folded over tightly as if to keep secrets safe. In the dim light of the kitchen, he broke the seal carefully, unfolding the thick letter inside. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and the words were typed, crisp and deliberate. The letter began with a simple greeting, acknowledging their brief encounter, and went on to explain who had sent it. It was from Joseph, or at least that was the name signed at the bottom, though the tone was formal and unfamiliar. The letter spoke of gratitude, deep and sincere, for Aaron's kindness in guiding a lost stranger through a city that often swallowed people whole. Joseph wrote about his own past, the years spent building something from nothing, the hardships and lonely victories that shaped him. And he told Aaron that his gesture had reminded him of the kindnesses he had once been shown, the moments that kept him going when everything seemed impossible. Then came the part that made Aaron's breath catch. Folded carefully inside the letter was a cashier's check, a sum so large it seemed impossible, $1 million. The numbers gleamed on the paper in bold, precise font, accompanied by the logo of a bank Aaron had only ever seen in movies. He stared at the check, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted it from the envelope and let it rest on the table. The weight of it was different than any he'd felt before, heavier in a way that wasn't physical but electric. Questions flooded his mind. Was it a mistake? Was someone playing a cruel joke? But the paper looked real, authentic, official. Aaron sat down slowly, the check and letter spread out before him on the worn kitchen table. The room was quiet, the city's distant sounds muffled by thick walls and closed windows. His eyes darted back to the letter, rereading the words, searching for a catch, a hidden condition, anything that would explain why a man he barely knew would offer such an impossible gift. There was none. Just a closing line that said, "Use this to build what you dream of, to change your story, and to believe that sometimes the world sees more than we expect." Aaron's thoughts turned to the apartment, the peeling paint, the rent notices stacked like grim reminders on the counter. To the grocery store, the missed shifts, the cold nights, an empty fridge. This check was a doorway, a chance that stretched far beyond the cramped walls of his life. But it also felt surreal, like a dream he wasn't sure he deserved. The kind of thing that might slip through his fingers if he didn't hold tight. He folded the letter slowly and slid both it and the check into his backpack, careful not to crease the edges. The quiet weight of them seemed to anchor something deep inside him, a flicker of hope, spark of possibility he had long tried to ignore. Aaron stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city lights that glittered like distant stars. Somewhere out there, Joseph was leaving the city behind, moving on to new places and new stories. But for Aaron, everything had shifted in the space of an envelope, a letter, and a check. He didn't know what would come next, or how to explain this sudden change to the people around him. He didn't even know if he was ready to believe it. But as the night deepened and the world outside his window faded into silence, Aaron made a quiet promise to himself. He would try. He would try to build something different, something that belonged to him, something real. The letter rested on the table before Aaron, like a fragile bridge between two worlds, the one he lived in and the one
Joseph had carried with him through the years.
The typed words were measured, formal in tone, but beneath them lay a quiet warmth that made the paper feel alive in his hands. Joseph described himself as a retired entrepreneur, someone who had started with almost nothing and built a travel company that had grown beyond what he ever imagined. The letter spoke of long nights spent in cramped offices, of missed family dinners, and the constant struggle to stay afloat in a world that favored those already ahead. He wrote of his travels, the countless cities and faces that blurred together, like scenes from a film, but it was the people, the strangers who showed unexpected kindness that remained etched in his memory. He spoke of a time when he had been young and lost, much like Aaron was now, relying on the goodwill of others to find his way. To hold on to hope when everything else seemed uncertain was Aaron's simple act of walking him across the city, offering help without asking for anything in return that had stirred something deep within Joseph. The letter explained how rare it was, in a world so quick to judge or turn away, to find a person willing to give their time and presence without expectation. That kindness had reminded Joseph of those moments from his own past, of hands extended in silent support, of roads made easier by strangers' compassion. Joseph confessed that he had been hesitant at first, unsure if Aaron was trustworthy or if the city itself might swallow him whole. But the boy's steady pace, the quiet confidence in his eyes, had shattered that doubt. It was not just the physical act of guidance, but the way Aaron seemed to carry himself, unshaken by the city's chaos, grounded in a way that inspired trust. The letter detailed how that brief encounter had reignited something Joseph had buried. Long ago, the belief that even small gestures could ripple outward, changing the course of lives in ways no one could predict. It was that belief that had moved him to send the letter, the check, and the offer to Aaron, hoping to provide a chance to dream beyond the struggles that often defined his days. Joseph acknowledged that money could never erase hardship entirely, nor guarantee happiness. But it could open doors, provide tools, and give the kind of freedom that comes from knowing you're not trapped by circumstance. He urged Aaron to use the gift, not just to survive, but to build, to create, and to honor the kindness that had sparked the chain of events. The letter ended with a quiet hope that Aaron would remember as Joseph had, that generosity and compassion were the true currency of a life well lived, that sometimes in the act of giving without expectation, one could find the greatest reward of all. As Aaron read and reread the words, the room around him seemed to fade, leaving only the connection between the boy who had walked a stranger through the city and the man who had once been that stranger. The letter was more than an explanation or a gift. It was a reminder of the unseen threads that link people together, even when the world feels too big and too cold to hold them. Aaron folded the letter gently, placing it back in his backpack alongside the check. For the first time in a long while, the weight in his chest felt lighter. Not because his problems had vanished, but because someone had seen him. Not just the worn clothes or the missed shifts, but the person underneath. The one who dared to care, to step forward, and to dream. He traced a finger over the edges of the envelope, the ink still clear despite the days that had passed since its arrival. Somewhere, far from this apartment and the quiet struggles of his life, Joseph had taken a moment to reach out across the distance. And now, Aaron carried that moment with him, a seed planted in the soil of his own future waiting to grow. Aaron sat at the kitchen table, the cashier's check resting heavily between his palms, the smooth paper cool beneath his fingers, despite the warmth of the room. The letter from Joseph lay unfolded on his lap, its words etched into his mind even as he struggled to make sense of the reality before him. The small apartment was silent, except for the quiet hum of the heater and the occasional creak from the settling walls. Outside, the city lights flickered faintly through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the worn tabletop. He didn't move. Minutes slipped by like hours. His gaze remained fixed on the check, a number so large it felt impossible, surreal, as if it belonged to someone else's life entirely. The neat font, the official seals, the embossed signatures, all of it screamed legitimacy. Oh, yet. The weight in his chest was confusion, disbelief, and a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. What was he supposed to do with this? He even accept it? The questions tumbled through his mind with no clear answers. He thought about the stack of rent notices folded neatly on the counter, the grocery bills piling up in the mailbox, the worn shoes on his feet, and the sketchbook filled with dreams he'd never dared speak aloud. The apartment door creaked softly, and Aaron's heart jumped as his mother stepped inside, tired but steady as always. She dropped her bag on the floor and peeled off her coat, the familiar sounds grounding him back to the present. She didn't look at him immediately, instead heading to the kitchen to hang her jacket on the hook. Aaron swallowed hard, the check still pressing against his palms. Words felt impossible. How do you tell someone who's spent years scraping together every cent that now, suddenly you have more money than you could have imagined? How do you explain that a stranger's gratitude had turned into a gift so enormous it could change everything? His mother hummed softly as she moved around the small room, placing keys on the table and pulling out a few papers from her bag. Aaron watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat, feeling the weight of silence pressing down. "I got something," he said finally, voice low and uncertain. She looked up, eyes tired but attentive. "What kind of something?" He hesitated, fingers tightening on the edge of the check, then slowly lifted the paper to show her. The expression that crossed her face was unreadable at first, a mix of surprise, confusion, and something cautious. "Where did this come from?" she asked, voice steady but soft. Aaron unfolded the letter and passed it to her without a word. She read it quietly, lips moving as she took in the words, the explanation. The gratitude expressed by a man who had once been lost and was now giving back in a way that seemed too good to be true. When she finished, she looked at him again, eyes searching. "Are you sure this is real?" He nodded, the certainty in his voice stronger than he expected. "It's a cashier's check." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the letter and the check resting between them like fragile things neither wanted to break. His mother reached out and placed a hand over his, her touch warm and steady. "This could change everything," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Aaron felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, but the questions remained. How do you move forward when everything you thought you knew about your life is suddenly upended? How do you keep your feet on the ground when the ground itself has shifted beneath you? He looked around the apartment, the faded curtains, the cracked walls, the small kitchen tables scarred with years of meals and moments both ordinary and difficult. This was home. This was the life they'd fought to hold on to. But now, it could be something more. His mother squeezed his hand gently, and Aaron finally allowed himself to breathe. The shock was still there, deep and raw, but beneath it was a seed of hope, fragile, yes, but real. No words came to explain it all, and maybe none were needed. Sometimes the quiet understanding between two people could say everything the heart struggled to put into speech. And for the first time in a long time, Aaron felt the possibility of a new beginning stirring inside him, carried not just in the weight of a check or the words of a letter, but in the simple, steady presence of someone who believed.
Aaron stood
In line at the bank, the cashier's check folded carefully in his pocket, the edges slightly creased from where he'd gripped it too tightly. Sterile scent of paper and polished counters filled the air, mingling with the soft murmur of voices and the occasional beep of the machines. He shifted from one foot to the other, trying to keep his nerves in check, but his heart pounded with every step closer to the teller's window. When it was finally his turn, he stepped forward, placing the check on the counter with a hesitant hand. The teller, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes behind thin glasses, picked it up and examined it carefully. Her fingers traced the embossed seal, the printed numbers, the signature in the corner. She didn't speak at first, just studied the paper with a practiced gaze that felt both reassuring and intimidating. "I'll need to verify this," she said softly into her headset, her voice low, but clear enough that Aaron caught the slight pause before she added, "Yes, The cashier's check for $1 million. Aaron swallowed hard, his fingers clenched into fists at his sides, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. He caught a flicker of doubt in the teller's eyes, not suspicion, but the kind of disbelief reserved for situations that didn't quite fit. Usual pattern. A few moments later, a manager appeared. A tall man in a crisp suit with an expression that balanced professionalism and curiosity. He took the check from the teller, scrutinizing every detail with a slow, deliberate gaze. Aaron watched as the man's fingers tapped the counter rhythmically, the only sound in the brief silence that followed. The manager then picked up the phone on his desk, speaking in clipped tones to someone Aaron couldn't hear. The conversation was terse but thorough. A series of questions and confirmations. Aaron stood stiffly, the hum of the air conditioning and the shuffle of papers the only backdrop to his growing anxiety. "Sir," the manager said finally, replacing the receiver, "we're confirming the legitimacy of this check with the issuing bank. This process may take a moment." Aaron nodded, his throat tight, but his voice steady when he said, "Thank you." Minutes passed, stretching out in a slow, uncertain rhythm. The bank's waiting area was filled with the soft rustling of brochures and the occasional cough from someone flipping through a magazine. Aaron's gaze flickered to the clock on the wall, willing the hands to move faster, could almost hear the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Who was this kid? Why did he have a check for $1 million? Was this some kind of mistake? Or worse, a fraud? When the phone on the manager's desk rang again, Aaron held his breath. The manager listened carefully, then looked up, his expression changing from guarded to one of quiet acceptance. "Been verified," he said. "The funds are available, and the check is genuine." Relief washed over Aaron in a wave, leaving him momentarily breathless. The tension that had gripped him loosened as the manager reached for a form and began explaining the next steps. "You'll need to provide identification and fill out some paperwork to process the deposit. We want to ensure everything is secure, given the amount." Aaron nodded, pulling out his ID from his wallet. The process was formal and slow, but with every signature he made and every box he checked, the reality of the situation settled deeper into his bones. The teller smiled at him when it was finally over, handing back his documents with a warmth that felt genuine. "Congratulations," she said softly. "That's not something we see every day." Aaron offered a small, grateful smile in return, the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. While he stepped out of the bank and into the afternoon light, the city seemed different, quieter, more possible. The check was real. The chance was real. And now, for the first time in a long time, Aaron felt the faint stirrings of hope beginning to take root. Aaron sat at the edge of his bed. The worn letter unfolded before him, and the cashier's check tucked safely inside his backpack. His fingers traced the faint smudges of ink in the corner of the letter, where a small phone number was neatly handwritten, a rare personal touch amid the typed words. The number had seemed insignificant at first, almost like an afterthought. But now it felt like a lifeline stretched across the miles between him and Joseph. He hesitated, heart thudding. With a mix of nerves and curiosity, what if the man didn't remember him? What if the call disrupted something private or unexpected? But the quiet hope that had been growing since the letter's arrival pushed him forward. Taking a deep breath, Aaron lifted his phone from the bedside table, tapping the number carefully. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice answered. Warm, calm, with a hint of surprise threaded through the greeting. "Hello?" Aaron's throat tightened. "Hi, it's Aaron, from the city, the one who helped you." His voice was tentative but clear. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then the man's voice softened, as if a memory had been unlocked. "Shh, Aaron. Yes, I remember you. How are you?" The recognition in the voice surprised Aaron. It was genuine, unforced, like he wasn't just a name on paper, but a person who had made a real impression. "I'm okay," Aaron said, trying to sound steady despite the flutter in his chest. "I just wanted to say thank you."
For everything.
Joseph's voice carried a quiet kindness, You don't need to thank me. You saved more than just my way through the city that day. It reminded me why kindness matters. Aaron swallowed, feeling the weight of those words settle around him. The man on the other end of the line wasn't just polite or distant, he was sincere, and that sincerity bridged the gap between their very different worlds. They spoke slowly at first, sharing fragments of their lives. Joseph told Aaron about his travels since leaving the city, the places he'd visited, the projects he'd started and ended. Aaron listened, careful to share only what felt comfortable, mentioning school, work, and his secret sketches of shoes he dreamed of making one day. Joseph encouraged him, his voice steady and warm. Dreams are the sparks that light the future, Aaron. Keep drawing, keep building. The world needs that fire. The conversation stretched longer than Aaron expected, the hours slipping away unnoticed. They talked about small things, favorite foods, music, the quiet moments that sometimes carried the most meaning. Joseph asked about Aaron's mother, the struggles and strengths that had shaped him. When it was time to say goodbye, neither of them rushed. Joseph's voice held a quiet promise. We will stay in touch. You have my number now? Call any time. Aaron smiled softly, feeling a connection that went beyond the letter and the check. It was a start, a new chapter, born from a simple act of kindness and a journey shared across a city's winding streets. As he ended the call and set the phone down, Aaron felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't just about the money or the chance to change his life. It was about being seen, remembered, and believed in. The first time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. A few days after their first call, Aaron's phone buzzed quietly on his bedside table late in the evening. He reached for it with a mix of anticipation and curiosity, the screen lighting up with an incoming message. It was from Joseph. The message was brief, but unmistakably warm. Aaron, before I leave the country, I'd like to meet you in person. I have something else in mind. The words hung in the air like a secret waiting to be unveiled. Aaron's mind raced with possibilities, none of which quite seemed real. A meeting. With Joseph, the man who had sent the check and the letter, it felt both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. He replied with a simple, when and where. The next day, Joseph sent back a time and place, a small cafe tucked away. On a quiet street not far from the market square where Aaron had helped him navigate weeks before, Aaron spent the day in a restless state, the anticipation weaving through his thoughts. He kept his sketchbook close, flipping through the familiar pages of shoe designs, but barely focusing on the lines and shapes. When the hour came, Aaron made his way to the cafe, the city's familiar hum softened by the early evening light. The place was modest, a handful of wooden tables, walls lined with local art, and the smell of fresh coffee mingling with baked bread. Joseph was already there, seated at a corner table, looking up as Aaron entered. The man's face broke into a genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes and softened the lines worn by years of struggle and success. Aaron, he said warmly, rising to greet him with a firm handshake that spoke of respect and gratitude. They settled into their seats, the clink of cups, and low chatter of other patrons, creating a backdrop of calm normalcy. Joseph wasted no time. I want to help you more, he said simply. Not just with money, but with opportunity. Aaron listened carefully, curiosity sparking beneath the surface of his usual guarded demeanor. Joseph explained that his travels had given him a wide network, people who believed in nurturing talent, especially those who came from nowhere but had the drive to build something real. I've seen what you can do, Joseph continued, eyes steady. Not just your kindness, but your mind, your dreams. I want to connect you with people who can help those dreams grow. Aaron's thoughts flickered to his sketchbook, the secret designs of shoes waiting quietly in the margins of his life. He hadn't told anyone, not even his mother, about the ideas that filled those pages, a world where he could turn imagination into reality, where his work could help others walk easier, dream bigger. Joseph seemed to sense this unspoken hope. I'm arranging for you to meet some folks in the industry, he said. People who can teach you, support you, even invest in your future. But it's not charity, It's partnership. You have to want it, and you have to work for it. Aaron nodded slowly, the weight of the offer settling around him. It was more than he'd dared to imagine, a chance not just to survive, but to thrive. The conversation shifted then to practicalities. How Joseph's company could sponsor a mentorship program. How Aaron could access resources and education beyond what his neighborhood or school could offer. Joseph's plans were detailed, thoughtful, and grounded in a belief that talent could come from anywhere, given the right chance. As the evening deepened, Joseph shared that his departure was imminent. He would be leaving the country soon, returning to places where his work awaited. But he promised this was not a goodbye. "This is the beginning of something," he said, "and I'll be here just a call away." Aaron felt a mix of gratitude and determination swell inside him. The man who had once been a lost tourist had become a bridge, a link to a future Aaron hadn't known was possible. When they parted outside the cafe, the city lights flickered softly overhead, and Aaron's steps felt lighter, his mind alive with possibilities. The offer wasn't just about money or chance. It was about belief, about seeing a path forward where before there had only been walls. He tucked the promise of that evening deep inside himself, ready to walk the next steps on a journey that was finally beginning to feel like his own. The hotel lounge was quieter than Aaron expected, its polished marble floors and high ceilings making every sound feel distant and muted. Soft golden light spilled from tall lamps, pooling across deep leather chairs arranged in intimate clusters. A few guests lingered with drinks, their conversations low and unhurried. Aaron hesitated just inside the doorway, his worn sneakers making almost no sound on the thick carpet as he scanned the room. Joseph was seated near the far window, a cup of coffee in front of him and a newspaper folded neatly to the side. He looked up immediately, spotting Aaron and Rose with a warm smile that cut through the formality of the surroundings. They shook hands, Joseph's grip firm and steady, and then settled into the chairs across from each other.
For a moment,
They spoke casually, small updates, a passing comment about the weather, the hum of the city outside. But then Joseph leaned back slightly, his gaze settling on Aaron with a kind of quiet intensity. "I'm glad you came," he said, his tone shifting into something more deliberate. Aaron nodded, sensing the weight in the man's voice. Acel rested his elbows on the armrests, fingers interlaced. "I gave you that money because you earned my respect, not because I felt sorry for you. But I want to ask something more of you." Aaron's posture straightened slightly. "What do you mean?" "Want you to use it for something that makes you proud every day," Joseph said. "Not just to keep the lights on or to get by, but to build something. Something that will matter to you when you're my age. Something you can look back on and know it came from your own hands, your own choices." Aaron let the words settle. His mind immediately flashed to the stack of rent notices, the grocery bills, the things that had defined survival for as long as he could remember. Using the money to make all of that go away seemed like the most obvious thing in the world. But Joseph's gaze was steady, as though he were urging him to look past the immediate, to see further than the week ahead. "I'm not saying don't. Take care of your needs," Joseph continued. "But if you only use this gift to survive, it'll disappear faster than you think. If you use it to create something that gives you purpose, it will keep giving back, not just to you, but to others." Aaron thought about his sketchbook at home, the pages filled with designs that no one had ever seen, shoes that blended function and style, ideas that had been born in the quiet corners of his mind while the rest of the world moved on without him. He had never said the words out loud to anyone, but now they pressed at the back of his throat. "There's something I've been working on," he said cautiously. "Designs for shoes. I don't know if they're good, but it's what I want to do." Joseph's expression didn't waver. If anything, there was a flicker of interest. And start there. Learn, build, find people who know more than you, and let them teach you. If it's what makes you proud, that's where their money belongs. The waiter passed by, refilling Joseph's coffee. But neither of them looked away from the conversation. Aaron felt the weight of the moment, not as pressure, but as possibility. "I've met a lot of people in my life who let their dreams fade because survival demanded all their attention. But I've also met a few who managed to fight for both, to live, and to build. You can be one of them, Aaron. You have the choice now. The hum of conversation from other tables filled the brief pause that followed. Outside the window, the city moved as it always had, but inside, the air between them felt charged with something quieter, steadier, the sense that a door had just been opened, one Aaron could step through if he dared. When they finally stood to leave, Joseph placed a hand on Aaron's shoulder. Whatever you choose, make sure it's something you'll never regret giving your time to. Pride lasts longer than money. Aaron carried those words with him as he left the lounge, the noise of the city swelling back into his ears. The money was real, but so was the challenge Joseph had laid before him. For the first time, he began to think not about what he could escape, but about what he could build. Aaron hesitated before pulling the sketchbook out of his backpack. It was the same battered notebook he'd been carrying for years, the corners bent and soft from constant handling, the cover marked with faint smudges of pencil and ink. To him, it wasn't just paper. It was a record of nights spent hunched over the kitchen table, of scraps of ideas drawn between shifts at the grocery store, of dreams too fragile to say out loud. He set it on the table between them in the quiet corner of the hotel lounge. For a moment, his hand rested on the cover as if it might be the last line of defense. "These are just ideas," he said, voice low. "I've never shown them to anyone. I don't even know if they're any good." Joseph leaned forward slightly, his expression calm and open. "May I?" Aaron nodded and slid the book toward him. Joseph opened it carefully, almost ceremoniously, and began to flip through the pages. He didn't rush. Each page was given time, his eyes tracing the lines, his brow furrowing slightly as he absorbed the details. Aaron sat rigid in his chair, every turn of the page feeling like a small test. He had braced himself for polite nods or vague compliments, the kind people gave when they didn't want to hurt your feelings. But Joseph didn't offer any filler words. He was quiet, intent, and that silence began to feel heavier than outright rejection. When Joseph finally looked up, there was no hint of mockery in his face. Instead, his voice was measured, but genuinely curious. "Where did you learn to draw like this?" Aaron blinked, caught off guard. I just looked at shoes, in shop windows, on the street, tried to figure out how they were put together, drew what I thought would work better." Joseph turned back to the pages. "You've got an eye for form, but also for function." "Look here," he tapped. One sketch showing a lightweight running shoe with an adjustable strap system. "This is practical. You've thought about movement, support, weight. That's more than most people your age consider." Aaron felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief creeping in. No one had ever looked at these drawings this way. Joseph's questions began to come, steady and purposeful. "What materials would you use for this one?" "Leather mesh? A blend?" Aaron swallowed, but answered. "A recycled blend for the upper, lightweight, water-resistant, rubber outsole with a patterned grip for wet surfaces." Joseph nodded, flipping to another page. "In production. Do you know what it would cost to make these? Who would you sell to? Where?" Aaron hesitated, but found himself speaking more easily than he expected. He had thought about these things, not in professional terms, but in late-night daydreams. Small runs first, maybe through online orders. Focus on quality, not volume. Build slowly. Joseph leaned back, still holding the book. "You've already been thinking like someone who could make this real. You just need the tools and the right people to help you." Aaron let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The dismissal he'd braced for never came. Instead, there was a serious engagement, as though his ideas belonged in the world of real plans and possibilities. "I didn't expect you to take it seriously," Aaron admitted quietly. Joseph smiled faintly. "The day you stop taking your own ideas seriously is the day they disappear. You've done the hard part. You've imagined something worth making. Now it's about turning sketches into shoes and shoes into a business." Aaron glanced at the sketchbook, suddenly seeing it differently. It's not just as a collection of drawings, but as a blueprint for something that could actually exist. Joseph closed the book gently and slid it back across the table. "Let's figure out how to make these more than paper," he said. The words lodged themselves in Aaron's mind, heavy with possibility. For the first time, the dream he had kept hidden in the pages of his sketchbook felt like it might belong outside of it. The air between them seemed to settle after Joseph closed the sketchbook, the weight of what had just passed lingering quietly. Aaron sat with his hands clasped on the table, unsure of what to say next. He could still feel the faint warmth in his chest from hearing his designs taken seriously. But beneath it was the old familiar caution, the knowledge that good things often slipped away just when they seemed close enough to touch. Joseph rested his elbows on the armrests of his chair, fingers steepled. His gaze was steady, not pressing, but deliberate. "Aaron," he began, "I've spent my life building something from nothing. I know what it feels like to start with only an idea and the will to keep going, and I've learned that no one truly succeeds alone." Aaron listened intently, not sure where the man was heading, but sensing it mattered. "I have people," Joseph continued, "friends and colleagues in different parts of the world, designers, manufacturers, marketers. Some of them owe me favors. Others are simply good at spotting potential. I can put you in touch with them. They can help you turn what's in that sketchbook into something you can hold in your hands." Aaron's breath caught slightly. Thought of seeing his drawings become actual shoes, not just imagined in pencil lines but crafted with real materials, was something he had never dared to believe could happen. He leaned forward slightly. "You'd do that?" "I would," Joseph said, "but only on one condition." Aaron straightened, bracing himself. "What's that?" "That you keep your focus and your integrity," Joseph said plainly. "The world will test both. You'll meet people who want to cut corners, take shortcuts, push you to sell out the parts of your work that make it yours. You'll be offered quick rewards that look good now, but take away what's possible later. If you want to build something that lasts, you can't lose sight of why you started." Aaron nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He thought of all the times he'd seen people in his neighborhood give up on their dreams for something that seemed easier in the moment. He'd seen how quickly the hard work of years could disappear when someone chased the wrong thing. "I'm not asking for perfection," Joseph went on. "We'll make mistakes. Everyone does. But I want your word that you won't let greed or fear steer the ship. You'll keep building something you can be proud of every single day. Whether it's a pair of shoes or the way you treat the people you work with." Aaron's voice was quiet but firm. "You have my word?" Joseph studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something he'd been weighing since the day they met. "Good, then we start here." Reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook, flipping it open to a page covered in neat handwriting. He tore it out carefully and slid it across the table. On the paper were names, phone numbers, and short notes beside each designer. "Works with sustainable materials. Small-scale manufacturer, reliable branding expert, understands new markets." "These are people I trust," Joseph said. "You call them, tell them I sent you. They'll know what that means." Aaron picked up the paper, the names blurring for a second as the reality of the moment hit him. This wasn't just talk anymore. It was the first tangible step toward the future he'd only ever imagined. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Joseph smiled faintly. "Don't thank me yet. Just do the work. Build something worth the help." As they stood to leave, Aaron slipped the paper into the back of his sketchbook, where it felt safe. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm, cars passing, streetlights flickering on. But for Aaron, everything felt subtly different. He had just agreed to something that could change the course of his life, and for the first time, the path ahead didn't feel like guesswork. It felt like the beginning of a plan. The workshop didn't look like much from the outside, just a narrow, weathered storefront tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a discount furniture shop. The paint on the door was chipped, the windows clouded with years of dust, but to Aaron, it felt like the threshold to something he'd been chasing silently for years. The rent was cheap, the space small, but it was his. Inside, the air carried the scent of leather scraps and industrial glue, faint but already settling into the walls. A single overhead bulb buzzed softly, casting a warm pool of light over the workbench he'd set up against the far wall. The table was cluttered with borrowed tools, an old sewing machine with a stubborn pedal, a hand press for eyelets, mismatched scissors, and a set of awls, dulled from use. Some had been lent to him by one of Joseph's contacts, others salvaged from garage sales and second-hand shops. The first few weeks were slow. Aaron spent most of his time just learning the feel of the materials, how thick leather needed to be cut differently than synthetic blends, how stitching tension could make or break the comfort of a shoe, how a millimeter too much in the sole could throw off the balance entirely. He ruined more pieces than he finished, but each mistake became a quiet lesson. Stretched late into the early hours of the morning, the streets outside would empty, the hum of traffic fading, but the sound of the sewing machine's steady rhythm filled the workshop. His hands moved carefully, methodically, pressing seams, trimming edges, adjusting patterns. He kept the sketchbook open on the bench, its pages now smudged with glue and pencil dust, guiding each step of the process. There was no one to impress. In those hours, no deadlines but the ones he set for himself. Sometimes frustration would creep in, a stitch gone crooked, a sole separating from the upper after hours of work. In those moments, he would sit back, staring at the half-finished shoe in his hands, and wonder if this was too big for him. But then he'd remember Joseph's words in the hotel lounge about building something to be proud of every day, and he'd pick up the needle again. On one particularly cold night, Ren pulled the space heater closer to his chair and wrapped his fingers around a mug of cheap instant coffee. The prototype on the bench was the furthest he'd gotten a sleek, lightweight sneaker with a recycled fabric upper and a molded rubber sole. The stitches were clean, the lines sharp. He turned it over in his hands, running his thumb along. The seam where the sole met the upper. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The nights blurred into a rhythm. School during the day, shifts at the grocery in the evenings, and the workshop until sleep became unavoidable. He learned to patch mistakes without starting over, to reinforce weak points before they failed. Every finished piece went onto a narrow shelf by the wall, each one better than the last. The shelf became a small timeline of his progress, from awkward, uneven early attempts to shoes that looked like they might actually belong in a store window. Occasionally, one of Joseph's contacts would stop by offering advice or demonstrating a new technique. Materials supplier showed him how to work with vegan leather. Retired cobbler taught him how to align the tread patterns for better grip. These visits were short, but they left Aaron with more than just knowledge. They reminded him he wasn't doing this entirely alone. Months slipped by, marked not by calendars, but by the steady improvement of his craft. The prototypes began to feel less like experiments and more like products, each carrying a piece of his vision from paper into the physical world. The borrowed tools became extensions of his hands, their quirks familiar, their limits something he could work around. One night, as he lined up 3 of his latest designs on the workbench, Aaron stepped back and looked at them under the dim light. They weren't perfect, not yet. But they were proof. Proof that what had started as a quiet dream in a sketchbook could take shape under his own hands. And standing there in the silence of the workshop, he realized this was the first place in his life where he felt entirely in control of what came next. Aaron boxed the shoes with more care than he had given anything in his life. The cardboard was plain, no branding yet, but inside the sneakers were wrapped in soft tissue paper, folded neatly so they wouldn't crease. He ran his fingers over the recycled fabric one last time, tracing the lines of the stitching he had perfected after countless failures. The soles were clean, the seams even, and the laces threaded with deliberate precision. They weren't just shoes. They were months of late nights, trial and error, and the stubborn refusal to quit when the work felt impossible. The delivery was arranged through one of Joseph's contacts, a woman named Clara, who handled much of his personal business. She had a small office across town, tucked into the corner of a co-working space. Aaron carried the box there himself, the winter, air sharp against his face as he walked. His backpack hung loose on his shoulders, the weight inside feeling both fragile and heavy. When he arrived, Clara greeted him with a warm but businesslike smile. She was efficient, moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who handled dozens of small tasks each day, each one important to someone. She inspected the package briefly, not to judge the shoes, but to ensure they would travel well. "Joseph's looking forward to seeing these," she said, sealing the box with reinforced tape. Damn, he's in Europe now. I'll make sure there. Shipped out this afternoon? Aaron nodded, his throat dry. Thanks. It was a short exchange, and when he left the office, the cold wind met him again, carrying with it the faint sting of nerves. The shoes were no longer his. They were out in the world, on their way to someone who had changed his life with a check and a challenge. He didn't know how they would be received, and that uncertainty followed him back to the workshop. The days after felt longer than they should have. He kept busy, working on new prototypes, sketching designs for different styles, trying to ignore the quiet tension in his chest. Every time his phone buzzed, he half expected it to be news about the shoes. But the messages were always from friends or his boss at the grocery store, never from Joseph or Clara. It wasn't until nearly a week later that the notification came. His phone lit up with a new message, the sender's name unfamiliar. When he opened it, the image filled the screen. Joseph stood on a narrow cobblestone street, the buildings behind him tall and close, their shutters painted in warm, muted colors. The air in the photo seemed crisp, the kind that made you keep your coat buttoned high. But what Aaron noticed first, what pulled his focus so sharply he almost forgot to breathe, were the shoes. His shoes, Joseph was wearing them, the fabric, catching the light just enough to reveal the subtle texture Aaron had chosen. The soles clean, but already shaped slightly by movement. They looked like they belonged there on those streets, in that life, far from the workshop where they'd been made. Beneath the photo was a short message. They fit perfectly. More importantly, they feel like they were made for me. Well done. Aaron? Aaron read the words over and over. The image burned into his mind. He sat down at his workbench, the phone still in his hand, and let the reality settle in. This wasn't just an idea anymore, not just something in a sketchbook or sitting on a shelf. It was real. It was out in the world, being worn, being seen. The workshop around him felt different now. The same tools sat on the bench, the same scraps littered the floor. But there was a shift, a sense that the work he was doing wasn't just for himself anymore. Someone halfway across the world had trusted his hands to create something worth wearing. And as he looked back at the photo one more time, Aaron realized that this first pair was more than a gift, more than a gesture. It was proof that he had stepped onto a path that could lead far beyond the cracked windows and flickering light of his small workshop. The late afternoon light slanted across the cracked pavement, washing the bus stop in a golden hue. The same weathered bench sat in its place, its paint more faded now, the edges worn smooth by years of waiting passengers. Aaron lowered himself onto it, stretching his legs out, the toes of his shoes catching the light. They were his shoes, not just in the sense that he owned them, but in the deeper sense that every stitch, every curve, every material choice had been his. The first model he'd made for himself, worn just enough to carry the faint scuff marks. Of use, but still holding their shape perfectly. The air smelled faintly of car exhaust and roasted chestnuts from a vendor down the street. It was colder than he remembered from that day months ago, and he pulled his jacket a little tighter. But the scene was the same, the road stretching out in both directions. Buses lumbering past at irregular intervals, people coming and going without much more than a glance at one another. Aaron leaned back, letting the rhythm of the city fill the quiet between his thoughts. He hadn't planned to be here today. His errands had brought him close, and without thinking, found himself walking to this exact spot, as if some part of him needed to return. It was while he was looking down the street, absently watching a cyclist weave between cars, that he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A man stood a few yards away, turning a folded map in his hands, the paper snapping faintly in the wind. He was middle-aged, dressed in layers that didn't quite match the season, a light jacket when the air called for something heavier, shoes more suited for walking indoors than across the uneven sidewalks here. The man's brow was furrowed, his eyes darting between the map and the buildings around him. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, glancing at passing pedestrians as if hoping someone might stop. Aaron knew that look instantly, a quiet plea for help paired with the hesitation of not knowing who to trust. For a moment, Aaron stayed seated, watching. It was almost eerie. The way the scene mirrored that first meeting with Joseph, the details were different. The man was younger. His map was paper instead of a phone screen, but the posture, the uncertainty, the slight isolation in the middle of a busy street, it was the same. Aaron stood, brushing the dust from his jacket. His shoes felt solid beneath him, the soles gripping the ground with the kind of comfort he'd designed for long walks. He crossed the short distance between them, his voice calm and easy. "Lost?" he asked. The man looked up, relief flickering across his face. "Yes, I'm trying to find the old library, but I think I've taken a wrong turn." His accent was faint, but Aaron caught the way. Certain words stretched a little longer, softened at the edges. Aaron glanced at the map, orienting himself. He knew the way. It wasn't far, but the path wasn't straightforward. A couple of turns through quieter streets, a small park cutting across what would otherwise be a confusing set of intersections. He could have just pointed. He could have given directions, sent the man on his way, and gone back to waiting for his bus. But as he stood there, the memory of that cold day months ago pressed in, the feeling of being needed for something small but meaningful. The chance to make a stranger's day easier. "I know the way," Aaron said, with a small smile. "Come on, I'll walk you there." The man hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to impose, but Aaron had already taken the first step toward the corner. The map crinkled as it was folded and tucked under an arm. As they started down the sidewalk, the conversation came. In fragments, where the man was from. What had brought him to this part of the city? The way the air here felt different from home. Aaron listened more than he spoke, pointing out small things along the way. A mural tucked between two buildings. A bakery with the best bread in the neighborhood. A shortcut through the park where the trees still held on to a few stubborn leaves. Despite the season, the walk wasn't long, but it carried a quiet symmetry that Aaron felt in his chest. I thought about the map that day, the handshake on the inn's doorstep, the letter, the check, the workshop, the first pair of shoes. And now here he was, retracing the spirit of that moment, not because he expected anything from it, but because he knew how much it could matter. When they reached the steps of the old library, the man turned to him with a grateful nod. "You really?" Aaron just smiled. "Safe travels." And with that, he turned back toward the bus stop, the soles of his own shoes tapping steadily against the worn stones, carrying him forward into whatever would come next.